Ceren Budak. So yeah, we're recording this meeting. So Ceren Hoca is an assistant professor of information at the School of Information and an assistant professor of electrical engineering and computer science at the University of Michigan, where I also spent 2 years as a postdoc. I really miss Ann Arbor. It's an amazing place. Her research interests lie in the area of computational social science. She utilizes network science, machine learning, and crowdsourcing methods, and draws from scientific knowledge across multiple social science communities to contribute to computational methods to the field of political communication, which is 100% what this group of young scholars are really interested in. So I'm sure everyone is really happy and also privileged to have you here. So without boring everyone further, I'd like to give the floor to Ceren Hoca. Hocam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Akın Hocam. Thank you for this great introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. Very excited to talk to all of you. I'm still sort of remembering when I started on this path as a, wanting to be computational social scientist. The term was like quite much newer back then. So it's very exciting and so great to see just a lot of initiative in this space. Looking forward to reading many of your papers in the following years. So with that, interesting, when I do, advanced, there we go. Okay. So today's talk is going to be about political conversations and characterizing their nature at scale. As Akın Hocam said, I'm broadly interested in political communication, and I mostly study either the news media or the citizens. I haven't done as much with the political elite yet, trying to stop myself from growing even bigger and sort of so anyway, so there this talk is going to be about some of my work in studying the citizens and how they engage in political talk online. And so the motivation is coming from the fact that casual, everyday political conversations are central to a vibrant deliberative democracy. If you're thinking about the way that most of us engage in politics, most of us are not going to protest. Most of us are not going to city halls. We really experience and participate in politics as we talk to our colleagues, our friends, and so forth. And these conversations can, at their best, teach us new perspectives, help us form informed opinions, and hopefully update preferences as we learn things. We'll talk about what they do when they are not at their best later on. What is interesting to me as a scholar who is interested in also in online communication is that these conversations are increasingly happening online in social media platforms that we use daily. So what this means is that this is demanding a deep inspection of online political talk to understand two things. And most importantly, one of them is the substance of these conversations. So by substance, I mean, what are the topics people are talking about? What is the position that they're coming from? And it's important to understand these because they help us understand public opinion and also the processes that shape it. But it's also equally important to understand the style with which people talk to each other, because certain conversation styles can encourage and support deliberation ideals, bring people in, and help them update preferences and form all these new perspectives, all these great things that I just mentioned. But there are certain conversation styles that actually block these deliberation ideals that we will have. So makes the place, for instance, less inclusive to certain groups and certain ideas. And those are the kinds of things that we want to avoid. So we want to understand what kinds of styles are conducive for good political talk and what kinds of styles are bad for it. Once we identify that, we can basically try to build systems that encourage the good ones. So this is where the sort of the high-level context in which I want to talk about these two studies. One of them is going to be about the substance, the other one is going to be about style. And part of the reason why I chose these is also sort of that it's hopefully maps nicely to the kinds of things that you have been working on the past few weeks in terms of the methods. We're going to be talking about some of these like supervised learning methods, in terms of the systems that we are, or social media platforms that we studied in these studies. One of them is on Twitter, the other one is on Reddit. And really we're trying to sort of bring these computational approaches coming from computer science, mostly in some statistics, to apply it to these substantive research questions that we're interested in. So I'll start with the one about substance, which is where we're going to be trying to understand how Twitter users frame immigration policy discussions. This is a joint work with Julia, and who's a PhD student that we are co-advising with David Jurgens, and this is a paper that was recently published in NACL. And the other study is where it's a collaboration with Paul Resnick. Again, the lead author is Ashwin, who is a PhD student that we are co-advising this time with Paul. And that was an ICWSM paper from last year. I'll point out that all the hard work, all the praise goes to our PhD students. All the mistakes and problems are the cause by the professors by us. So let me just start with that first one, which is that how do Twitter users frame immigration policy discussions? So I'll start with an example, given that I'm living in the US, I'll give kind of set the example from here. I'm showing you two quotes from our current and past presidents. Biden here is saying immigration has always made us stronger. It's essential to who we are. And Trump is saying we must have strong borders and not let illegal immigrants enter the United States. So what Biden and Trump are doing here is that they're illustrating distinct framings of immigration, which means that they are both highlighting particular aspects of an issue and basically hiding the others by design in order to increase the salience of that particular aspect they are interested in. So here you see that Biden is highlighting kind of cultural identity, that the fact that immigration is core to the US cultural identity, while, for instance, Trump is highlighting security and as a frame through which they are looking at immigration. So framing can impact how people understand issues, attribute responsibility, and endorse solutions, and has major implications for public opinion. And that's the reason why there is a whole subfield in political communication that's dedicated to framing theory, but they have primarily focused on framing by the mass media and by the political elite. Yet, as I said in the beginning of my talk, people converse with each other through casual political conversations and can influence one another and sometimes even influence elite behavior. So our goal for this paper was to computationally identify the frames used for immigration by people on social media. And after basically identifying them, we want to understand how they were constructed and what are their effects. So that's the goal. So the first question to ask might be why study framing through computational approaches, and why study it on social media? One benefit is the scale, right? So if you study things on social media, this allows us to have access to vast amounts of data, and the amount of data just by itself is not valuable per se, but it allows us to examine differences across kind of different subgroups, right? So as opposed to just looking at average behavior when you have small data, when you have a large data set such as the ones that we have access to from social media, we can really start to slice and dice the data and understand heterogeneity in different frame building or frame setting effects. So here we can look at across different regions and ideologies to see what kind of frames are people using as a function of their ideology or where they live, and that speaks to a subfield in framing theory, which is frame building. And the other valuable aspect of doing these things on social media is that, unlike surveys where you kind of sample people, you take them out of their context and ask them questions, and you can only kind of get a sense of what they think. Here, we observe people in their context. We observe people, what kind of information they're exposed to, and what kind of things they interact with, so that we can see what are the effects of using a particular type of frame. So we can look at frames and see how well they resonate with different groups of people using, for instance, retweets and favorites, and that helps us examine questions that relate to frame setting. And here we're basically making use of the network of social media. So that's basically, again, these are sort of subfields and important sort of research questions within political communication. Just to kind of simplify things for us, when we're thinking about frame building, we really think about the frames as dependent variables, right? These are the things that we're trying to model as a function of some external factors like ideology. When we're looking at frame setting, things are flipped. Now our frames are independent variables, the things that impact the Ys, and Ys are frame effects, which is like whether or not you would like or retweet something as a function of the frames that are used in those tweets. So that's really just like a very high level overall kind of simplification of what's happening here. So a big part of doing just, I would say, generally computational social science work, and in particular for our study, is that you first need to have a really sort of good grounded definition of what a frame is. And so here there are three high-level approaches that people have used. The first one is to define issue generic frames. So issue generic impulsive frames are aspects of an issue that are important for policymaking. Amber Boyson has really foundational work in this space. She and the collaborators have, among other things, have created these code books that you can use to try to map different types of frames that are useful across different issues. So, as the name suggests, these categories apply to a number of different issues, right? So you can have an economic frame as you're talking about immigration, but you can have the same thing when you're talking about, for instance, healthcare as an issue as well. So here you can see that we have economic, capacity and resources, morality and ethics, and so forth. These are the issue in this, and the rest that you see here are issue generic frames that have been identified in past work. There are also issue specific frames. And these, by design, are specific to the issue that you're trying to study. And in past work that is focusing on immigration, that has focused on the portrayals of immigrants. So here I'm showing you our categorization that is mostly based on the Benson study from 2013, where you can frame immigrants as victims, heroes, or a threat. And they can be a victim of global economy, war, and so forth, or they can be a hero because they increase cultural diversity, because they integrate well into our societies, or they're like hardworking people, for instance, right? So those would be kind of hero frames. And they can be framed as a threat because they take jobs away, or public order, and so forth, right? So those are basically the high-level categories of frames that were identified in past work that are specific to immigration itself. A third category is by Shanto Iyengar, who's a very established scholar in political communication. So basically started this whole field of work on narrative frames. So a policy conversation that a news article or let's say political elite can be talking about can be episodic or it can be thematic. So if it's episodic, and these are usually studied in news media context, if a news article is using, for instance, an episodic frame, it means that the message provides concrete information about a specific people, specific places, or events. So here, an example could be, for instance, a story about an immigrant, a particular immigrant. That would be an episodic frame. If the message of the article is more abstract, placing stories in broader political and social context, that would be a thematic frame. So things that are about what kind of policies are being enacted, what are their broader effects, and so forth would be, for instance, a thematic frame. And these are found to be quite important in past work because that really changes where people place blame, where people place responsibility, and therefore are important to understand. So basically for our work, what we needed to do, and I think that like in computational social science work, when you're trying to do impactful work, it's kind of important to do this sort of lit review to try to see how people approached these questions that you're trying to address. And what we have found as we're doing this past work lit review is that most of the natural language processing work focus primarily on issue generic frames. While what we wanted to do, our work is sort of within that natural language processing work, we wanted to identify all three, given the fact that the other two have been found impactful in political communication scholarship. So that's kind of how we are defining frames. And I'll give you a little bit more about the information about this when we're talking about data annotation. But in terms of where our data are coming from, our data are coming from Twitter decahose. So this is data access that we had as part of University of Michigan, has access to 10% Twitter sample. And what we did is we identified all English tweets in 2018 and 2019 that mentioned immigration related keywords. What happened is we started from the sort of obvious ones that you can think about, immigration, immigrant, and so forth, collected all the data. And then this initial dictionary then was augmented using the word embeddings. So basically finding semantically similar words to the initial words using glove and word2vec. And that allowed us to identify other keywords that weren't very obvious to us, and actually was quite useful in identifying keywords that were particularly more popular in the European context compared to the US context, for instance. So that would be one, again, I would say, is you're doing data collection. The way that you collect data has really important implications for the research that you do afterwards. So it's important to find ways to try to kind of make up for the researcher bias that you might be starting from. So our bias, for instance, perhaps was that we were coming more from a US context, and we still wanted to study the UK and the EU, so we could sort of let the data guide us in identifying other keywords that were not obvious to us. So region information, we used a location inference tool, and then, sorry, I'm somehow, there we go, this is much better. This is, which basically is an optimization over the social network, with a total variation based on the base objective, and provides basically a scalable, a distributed solution to identify locations. Basically, that inference tool is using the network information to infer locations of people. We focused on 3 regions: the United States, United Kingdom, and the European Union. And we also were interested in, again, as part of our frame building study, the ideology information. And here we're using Barbera's Bayesian spatial following model, which is basically an ideal points model that gives, for each social media user, an ideology estimate as a function of the people that they are following. And this model is basically initialized using the congressional. You can use it and you can define your own initial set, but originally was based on congressional members. So as a function of what kind of congressional members you're following and their party, can infer the ideology of people. So as a result, we had, using this approach, we had 2.66 million tweets, and 86% of those were from the US, 10% from the UK, and 3% from the European Union. So you can see an imbalance in our data. A big part of the reason as to why this is happening is that we're actually looking at only English tweets. So I should just say it from the beginning that the analyses that we have about the EU are not really going to be that representative of general immigration conversations in the EU. This is people who are using English to talk about immigration that are residing in the EU, right? So it might be expats, it might be people who are, for certain particular reasons, choosing to converse in English. Our data annotation is tightly kind of coupled with our definitions of what frames are. For generic policy frames, we initialize our codebook using the Boyson et al. Study. For the immigration specific ones, we start with the Benson's codebook, but we add a category for framing immigrants as victims of war, especially given that our study overlapped with the Syrian refugee crisis. That was an important category to include. And for narrative frames, we initialized using Iyengar's approach. I say initialize because past work focuses on elite communication on mass media. So they're really looking at long text articles. And our codebook needed a lot of adjustments to account for changes necessary to analyze the Twitter content. So the question is, what do you do with mentions? What do you do with hashtags? What do you do with URLs? Like, these are kinds of things that are not described in the code books that we used, and therefore needed to be included here. I'm saying code book, but I actually don't know if folks know what I mean when I say code book. Does anyone want to chime in to say what or maybe I can look at the participants to see. Hold on, why is this happening? And there we go. Maybe sort of just raise your hand if you think you know what a code book is, so that I can see if I need to define it here. Great. Okay, so that's good. I need to define what this is. So code book is, you can think about it as almost sort of a set of instructions that a kind of a human annotator would need to follow to label something as one thing or another, right? So basically, it's an instructions, it's like definitions, it has exclusions, it has examples that you would follow to be able to do content analysis. And the goal of a code book is that two different people can start from the same code book and will be able to reliably code the same content. And by that, I mean that they would agree on what the label would be, right? So we basically had, in our case, we had really, I think we had in total, our code books were 26 pages long to describe all of these different kind of generic, issue specific topics and episodic and thematic frames. And we have the definitions, we have examples, we have exclusions and so forth. And basically coders get trained. They follow that code book, label things, and then we look at their reliability. And if they're reliable, then we can set that the code book as a good code book to follow and continue our research. And so that's basically the process. So we had to make a number of changes. So code book tuning step required some of these kind of reliability coding and changes to the code book. Once we reached a stable code book, we had a single annotator coding for the training data set. But for the validation data set, we performed consensus coding. And the reason is that really we're just basically doing cost-benefit trade-off. So the models, supervised learning models, can be robust to noise. And there it's okay, perhaps, that your training example is coming from one person, but we want to be really sure that the way that we evaluate our models was robust, and therefore we did consensus coding. And so what this ended up with is that we had 84% of labeled tweets had at least one issue generic frames, 85% had a narrative frame, and 51% had an issue specific frame. So even from this point, you're already seeing big differences in the use of different framing typologies, right? That if you were to focus, for instance, only on issue specific frames, you would miss out on a vast amount of conversation on immigration discourse. I'm happy to go into the details about these data annotation steps in a Q&A. The high level point I will make is that this was the most labor intensive part of this research. And I would argue it's the most important part of the research design. So I'm coming from a computational perspective, and like that, what we're doing is sort of the, let's say, the supervised learning models and so forth. But really, a good research really heavily relies on a kind of high quality data, and high quality data really relies on spending a lot of time and effort to make sure that your data annotation process is robust. So that's kind of the high level point I will make, is especially for those of us that are sort of more excited about computational approaches. I'll say most of my time is actually not spent there. Most of our time is really making sure that we have kind of good constructs, we have operationalized them well, we have measured them well, until you get to that modeling point is where most of your time is spent, honestly. Okay, again, I'll be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if there are any questions. But with that, let me just kind of go into the results, where I'm going to briefly be talking about the models that we have used as well. So the way that we have labeled our data, a particular tweet can be evoking multiple frames. It can be actually evoking multiple generic frames. It can be talking about economy and security at the same time. It can be framing an immigrant as both a job threat and a public security threat, or it can be framing an immigrant as a hero because of immigration as well as being a good worker. So basically what we're doing here is that we have multiple labels for each tweet. So we have different models that we're using. One of them is sort of the random prediction. You're randomly predicting how often would you get things right. And the other one is kind of, we say logistic regression, but this is with L2 regularization. as a sort of baseline traditional model, supervised learning model that we have used, which you might have some familiarity with given the past few weeks that you have been working on things. And then we also use language models. So Roberta is an extension on BERT. It modifies some hyperparameters in BERT, including removing BERT's next sentence pre-training objective and training with much larger mini batches and learning rates. It's shown to improve the performance of BERT in various kind of language NLP tasks. So we're using Roberta. There is a sort of shared pre-trained model, which is trained on vast amounts of data. So if we use that model as is, and then we just have an output layer that predicts these labels that we have, we see a huge improvement on top of what we see in logistic regression, right? So from 0.3 F1 to 0.6 F1. And you can also have an improvement on top of this if you fine tune this language model, which is that you're basically initializing the language model using the pre-trained model, but then you're basically keep training based on the specific data that you have. In our case, it's the Twitter tweets that we have about immigration. So that's, we're seeing a clear improvement for a fine-tuned Roberta model, which is what we're going to be using for the rest of our analysis. So I don't have the plot here. I have it in backup plots, but I'll make one point. As expected, you see the highest improvement for less common frames that have fewer training samples. So this is where the language models shine. Language models are really helpful when you don't have as much training data. If you have a lot of training data, at some point, logistic regression is going to sort of catch on if you have the right regularization. So that's an important aspect to keep in mind. And given how skewed conversations are in terms of how much people rely on different frames, it's really important for our case. Like, for instance, economic frames are very common, so you can learn them quite well, but there are certain types of frames that are not very common, and that's where the language models are quite helpful. So breakdown of performance across frame typologies is you see here. So I'm showing you precision and recall, and F1, which is basically a combination of these two concepts. And I'm also showing you LRAP, which is label ranking average precision. And this is basically the average over each ground truth label assigned to each sample of the ratio of the true versus the total labels. So it really is basically, it's helpful in sort of multi-label classifications. When you have multiple labels that can be assigned to each item, LRAP is another approach you can use for doing this evaluation. So just sort of a kind of methodological point here. So you can see here that the sort of easier frames for us are like narrative frames are a lot easier, and you can see that issue generic frames are next easiest in terms of like the F1, but sort of comparable in terms of LRAP. But basically what we're seeing is overall there are differences in the way that these automated approaches perform in doing this classification. So when we start looking at our kind of model's performance, we already can start making some inferences about substantive questions that we might have. So there is a kind of literature that talks about hegemonic framing, and which is basically represents the selection of integrated and consistent frames at the exclusion of other potentially oppositional frames. So where basically you just really are being, if you're being really consistent in in highlighting one frame and always kind of excluding others. So what we're seeing in past work is that the suggestion is that conservative, media, and elites are more consistent in framing than liberals. So that's a finding in mass media and political elite. What we're seeing here is indications that this is also the case for citizens, because if you look at how well our models perform, they actually perform much better for conservatives compared to the liberals, especially for issue-generic, issue-specific frames. And this is despite the fact that we have so many more liberals in our data set, right? So if you have more data from a certain kind of group, you would think that you would actually do a better job in identifying their language. But despite that, we're seeing that we're doing a much better job with conservatives, and that's indication that they are actually a lot more consistent in their frame usage, and therefore it's easier for the model to identify them. So I had started this by saying that we were going to talk about frame building and frame setting. And in frame building, our goal was to understand the role that, for instance, ideology plays in the frames that people use. So here we estimate the effects of ideology and region on frame choice using a mixed effects logistic regression modeling. Here, basically, what we're doing is we're controlling for a number of temporal factors. So we, for instance, have a random effect for the month, just in case there are certain events that are happening in the outside world that's sort of dictating how what people are talking about. We have user level attributes, such as, for instance, are you a verified user? Are you not a verified user? How many followers you have? How many friends you have, and so forth. And tweet level features as well. So here I'm going to show you results for ideology. So again, if you remember the earlier parts of the talk, I was trying to say that we're trying to understand whether or not you use a frame as a function of these temporal, user level, tweet level features. And the one feature that we are really interested in here is, what is your ideology? So here we're focusing only on US users, because the way that we initialized the Barbera et al. Model was that we were using the congressional members. So we think we have a good estimate for people in the US, but not necessarily in the UK or the EU. So here we're seeing that as you go on this x-axis to the right, you're looking at frames that are more conservative. And if you go to the left, you're seeing frames that are more liberal. In that that's the effect size of that ideology is indicating indicated in the x-axis, and the frames are ordered from basically the most left-leaning versus towards the most right-leaning frames. So what do we see here? What we're seeing is that immigration-specific frames are the most ideologically extreme. So the color of the bar is giving us the frame typology. So the blue one is issue-specific frames, the orange one is generic, and the green one is narrative. So the ones that are all the way on the top, all the way in the bottom, that are highest beta, highest negative beta, and highest positive beta are these issue-specific frames. So we're seeing that, for instance, a public order, a threat fiscal, all the threat ones are at the conservative side, and all of these like victim and hero ones are on the liberal side. We know that issue-generic frames can generalize across different studies. But we are seeing here value for studying issue-specific frames, because they reveal patterns that are obscured by issue-generic frames. So for instance, if you look at cultural identity, it's like a little left-leaning, right? So it's the beta coefficient is negative, but small. But cultural identity really corresponds to on the left side, hero cultural diversity, hero integration are a lot higher. On the right side, threat of national cohesion is again about the cultural identity, and it's a lot more right-leaning. So on average, cultural identity is slightly left-leaning, but it's really obscuring these differences that are revealed once we study issue-specific frames. And then we're also seeing that liberals tend to use episodic frames, focusing on specific people and events, while conservatives use more thematic frames that place stories in broader socio-political contexts. So this is, you can see the thematic all the way down and episodic on the way up. And that again has implications. Again, the past work shows that when you frame things in episodic ways, people don't necessarily kind of place responsibilities correctly, versus thematic frames are sort of found to be normatively sort of better for shaping public opinion. So it seems like, you know, conservatives are doing a better job in framing things in a way that would shape public opinion. We also looked at region. What's the effect of region? It's a similar idea applies here. We're using a mixed effect logistic regression model, and we looked at the comparisons between the US and the EU, and comparisons between US and the UK. So I actually have both of these here. I don't know if anyone has any preference for which one you want to see, if people are interested more in the EU or the UK.
Guys, what do you say?
Sorry?
No, I'm just asking to our participants. So let's see a raise of hands. Who wants to go with the EU? Let's do a reaction. So for example, I'm raising my hand for EU. Let's see how many people. Let's say 3, 4. Well, that means the majority wants the United States, I guess.
The UK is compared. So I'll say
US, UK.
I'm already coming from a position. So yeah, it was we were always comparing to the US. That's I should say, sorry, that is like we're definitely coming from a very US perspective. Okay, so the UK, I guess, is the one. Great. And let's pass this. So we're basically here looking at the comparisons between US and the UK. And so we are looking at a similar plot here. The beta coefficient is looking at the beta coefficient of whether or not somebody's from US or the UK. The positive values that are more associated with the UK, and the negative values are more associated with the United States. So what we're seeing is that the more ideologically extreme frames, or at least ideologically extreme in the US, are more significantly associated with US-based conversations compared to both actually US and the UK and the EU. So we see public order, crime and punishment. These are all sort of more central to how the United States is talking about immigration compared to, for instance, the UK. The other thing that was interesting to us, and that was, I think we have sort of reasons as to why this is happening from past work in political communication, is that the UK is more likely to invoke labor-related frames. So you can see that hero worker, global economy, and so forth are a lot more UK oriented. And this is actually aligned with patterns in the news media and could be related to differences in the labor market and immigration laws. In that, so in the UK, migrants have proper authorization, like work authorization, compared to the US, where unfortunately, a lot of immigrant workers need to work in sort of these hidden away markets. And therefore, they're perhaps maybe either seen as a competition, which is why they might be sort of seen as a threat in that case, but also as seen as more of a worker, because that's sort of part of the identity. So you can see that both for the positive ones, hero worker, as well as threats as a job. So people see immigrants more as a threat to themselves in the UK in their discussions compared to the US, where they're seen less of a threat, unfortunately, because they're sort of hidden away in these separate sort of work situations.
Ceren Hocam, Venia has a question.
Yeah.
What time period is this for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we looked at 2018 and 19. So this is sort of the still sort of Trump world, and maybe kind of connected to this is I mean, at least in the United States, immigration conversations have been changing drastically in the last decade. So we are going forward. We're actually very interested in doing this temporal analysis to have models that work for a longer period of time. But we did start with only a two-year frame. So if people have other ideas as we're looking at these, the UK and the EU settings, I'm not a IR person, so I'm interested in really getting the perspective of others and what they're seeing here and what they're not seeing. Does that answer your question, Vanya?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay. So this was about frame building. Frame setting is this, again, a whole different field of study, which is we're trying to understand what is the impact of using particular frames. And it might be that people already have certain frames that are important in their minds, and as you invoke them, they might be more or less willing to engage with you, accept your ideas, and so forth. So the nice thing about social media is that we can observe this. We can see how people react to tweets, so we can understand, what is the impact of using different frames and how people engage with such information. Gizem, do you have a question? I saw Gizem raised hand.
Oh no, she doesn't. Okay.
Okay. All right. Never mind. So I won't show the plot here. And it's in the paper. I'll just really summarize a few things from here, which is that one, we're saying that frames impact favorites and retweets differently, suggesting that the strength of framing depends on the specific type of behavior. For instance, we see that cultural and human interest-related frames are more associated with more favorites, while political, safety, and security frames are more associated with retweets. And it might be because of the affordances of these social media platforms and how people use these different cues. Like, you might like something because you agree with it, or you might retweet something because you think that it should have, it's important for people to know. So it might be that you like when you see nice stories about an immigrant, but maybe you don't think that that's a thing that needs to be retweeted. But it might be that people are feeling concerned about their security, and when they see this scary, immigrants attacking our country, whatever frames, they're like, oh, other people should know this and whatever, protect themselves. So they might be using these retweets and favorites differently, and we are actually seeing that in the effect of frames themselves. And then that's one high level thing I will highlight here. For narrative frames, what we expected was that episodic frames tend to be more emotionally engaging, while thematic frames can be sort of more persuasive. So we were expecting that for likes or favorites, we would see more likes on episodic frames. In reality, we actually did not observe that. What we did observe is that both of those were linked to roughly similar effect sizes for retweets and favorites, highlighting the importance of having a clear narrative. So the way that we labeled our data is we look at a tweet, and if it's clearly episodic or clearly thematic, we label it as such. If it's unclear, it gets no label. So what we're seeing is that if you have either one of those, you have a strong effect size, which is that both of those really, that as long as you have a clear narrative, it is more likely to end in you having kind of your tweets having higher engagement for both retweets and favorites. So before I close this conversation, and maybe you can sort of go on and some breakout rooms to discuss and see if there are any kind of questions that we want to bring up to the bigger group, I want to highlight some important caveats or limitations. It's really important, I think, for our kind of work to not only be clear about what we do, but also what we do not do. And that's going to be a big responsibility that you're going to have as a computational social scientist as you do your own work as well. So I do hope that we provide a new lens for examining how ordinary people build frames and how these frames affect the power of their messages. But there are various limitations. One limitation is that we basically reduce people to their social identities, such as region and ideology. But people are a lot more than that. They're a lot more nuanced than that. So we should just be acknowledged when we're doing these kinds of simplifications. The other thing is representativeness. I say ordinary people, but I don't mean ordinary people representative of the people in the United States, in the EU or the UK. This is Twitter conversations and not really representative of broader public opinion. A very important caveat is that we're using English tweets only, and therefore whatever we're analyzing for, especially the EU, is definitely not representative of immigration conversations in the EU overall. We know that there are people speak various different languages, and these are not captured here. This is of course the case in the US as well, but perhaps a more of a concern in the EU setting. And it's also important to acknowledge the malicious use of frame setting findings. You can imagine that people might want to use either our results or our models going forward to try to find what kind of things would have high impact and try to kind of shape their models, their messages to convince people. And that's a thing that I'm currently, all I'm saying is we acknowledge that, one hopefully protection mechanism against that is that things change over time quite fast in these settings. But it's important to know that that your models, your studies can be used for malicious use as well. So before I have this other study that is about style. I talked so much longer than I thought I was going to. So why don't we take a break? And folks can have, maybe we can have folks in breakout rooms just so that people can chat with each other if there are any reflections that come up, and then they can also take a short break. And now we can, yeah.
Let's take a 5-minute break, like really quick, so that people can just like get coffee or tea, whatever. And when we return back, Emre is going to assign people into the rooms. But let's give people like a very simple question so that they can think about this for 5 minutes. And when they go directly into the breakout rooms, they start discussing that immediately. Like if you had to just give them one sentence question, what would that be?
Right. I mean, I guess I would say it's one. So that I was told that that people are starting to think about their projects. By the way, I should note that our data, our labeled data, our models are all on GitHub. So if you're working on projects that are sort of related to that, this might be a source for you to use for your projects. But one idea might be like, just think about for any other kind of work, what are potential limitations, what are some potential future work, or what are some studies that you had in mind that you think that you can use. So I think that's a conversation for the group to have amongst themselves. I mean, I don't know if we want to do this Q&A. I wanted to do the Q&A, just general questions about the study as well. If sometimes people feel more comfortable kind of talking about these things with their classmates before asking the speaker. So any kind of question that were like sort of unclear, or future work, those are also sort of welcome here.
Yeah, I think what we do is that the thing that worked previously is that we take a break. People go into the breakout rooms. You know, you, me, Emre, we basically go group after group and listen to their conversations and give feedback. Maybe we do that for 15 minutes, and when that small group discussion ends, we do one big, huge group.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's take a 5-minute break, and conveniently enough, let's come back here at 18:01 Turkey time, Istanbul time, and then we're all going to go into groups. So see you very soon. Professor Budak, for being with us. I realized that we never took a group photo with this group. So let this be the first. So if everyone can like turn on their cameras, I'm going to take a group photo and maybe hopefully like wave our hands so that we look really nice maybe. So, all right.